Good morning and good afternoon, art historians. Welcome to another day of AP Review. Today we'll be looking at the ancient Near East. And before we start that, let me just introduce you to Jack. Jack is currently in his kennel. We hope Jack stays quiet, but you may hear him. I'm going to try to keep that from happening. We hope he stays like this. Right. So just so you can meet the new puppy, a little Jack Spam, we're really happy to have this addition to the family. Plenty of time to raise a puppy right now. And so with no further ado, we will kind of move on to the business part of things. But today we are covering the ancient Near East. So let's start with our official slideshow. Well, hold on, let me do it. There we go. So my name is Allison Napier, and I've been guiding you through along with my friend John Gunnan the last couple weeks, and we will be with you a couple more weeks and probably close to the AP exam time to help get you ready. And so we're going to crash course today through a region full of different cultures, all focused on creating works of art that express ideas of religion and power and authority. And we're working on skill 1C. So we're going to see how these cultural priorities affect the styles and materials and the content of the works of art and the information that they communicate. And so I start today with kind of a collage of the images and a little tip of the hat to my friend Lewis Carroll. One of my favorite poems is the Jabberwocky, and I always used to read it to my students when I gave out tests. So, the time has come, my little friends, to talk of finer things, in this case, to talk of ancient Near Eastern things, of ziggurats and votive figures, of Lamassus and kings. So we jump in, starting with a map. And so the ancient Near East is the home of early civilizations with a region roughly corresponding to the modern Middle East. And we focus a lot on Mesopotamia today, which is modern Iraq, Turkey, Southwest Iran, parts of Syria and Kuwait. But actually the whole region would include larger areas, the larger area, what we see here on the map. The history of the ancient Near East really begins with the rise of Sumer in the 4th millennium BC, and the date on that when it ends kind of varies. The ancient Near East is considered one of the cradles of civilization, and it's here that an intensive year-round agriculture was first practiced, leading to the rise of the first dense urban civilizations and settlements and the development of different civilized institutions, social stratification, centralized government, empires, organized religion, organized warfare. These cultures also produced the first writing system with cuneiform, the first alphabet, the first currency in history, and law codes. And they also have other advances such as astronomy, mathematics, and the wheel. And during this period, their city-states will become increasingly large, and eventually the regions will be controlled by large militaristic empires that will conquer a different number of cultures. This area is in great demand because of this region right here between Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia, as it's called, the land between two rivers, very fertile soil, great for growing crops, raising animals. And this is where our first complex urban centers grow. The history of Mesopotamia really tied to the greater region, and we lump it in sometimes with Western civilization and Western history, which might be maybe a little bit of a misnomer because it's technically not located in what we consider Western or European culture. The West became very interested in it, however, because of the Holy Lands and the complex of religion that stems from this region. So it remains kind of a stark region, or a region of stark geographic contrast. We have vast deserts rimmed with rugged mountain ranges, punctuated by lush oases between the two rivers. Flowing through this topography are rivers, and an irrigation system can develop using these bodies of water. Specifically in southern Mesopotamia, and this will provide the support for the very early urban centers here. The region lacks stone, and this will affect what the architectural structures look like and their composition. There is also no timber, and there are not very many precious metals. Historically, it's relied on long distance trade for with its agricultural products to secure these materials. And large-scale irrigation systems and labor required for farming were managed by a centralized authority that usually ran the city-state as well. We've actually touched base with this. This is not from Unit 2, the Ancient Mediterranean today, but actually from Unit 1, our Global Prehistory. So we touch base with the Ancient Near East in Unit 1 of the image set with this work. The bushel with ibex motifs, a prehistoric pottery work originating from Susa, which was a very important ancient Near Eastern city and now present-day Iran. And the beaker was made using terracotta. It's a large vessel and a funerary item found among the burial sites of the first inhabitants of Susa. It's credited with being kind of one of the originators of the animal style, a decorative approach with an emphasis on animal motifs. And so you see these animals on the beaker itself, long-necked birds, dogs, the ibex or the mountain goat as well, dominating the decorative scheme. A little bit of a closer detail to kind of look at these elements. This is of a hand-thrown vessel, the walls with a stylized decoration, creating a synthesis of environmental elements and agricultural communities. This frieze of aquatic birds, similar to egrets, you can see their long necks here at the top, the long narrow bodies of running dogs or hunting dogs, probably salukis, that were adapted to the stepped plateaus in the region. And then on the right, this ibex or mountain goat, created pretty much using very simple geometric forms, triangles with these large ram's horns or large mountain goat horns dominating this design. And in the center, you see a round badge or emblem that seems to be associated with a clan, that could be associated with the potter who created it, maybe like a brand, or it could be for the patrons who commissioned it. So that's really our first ancient Near Eastern work. And then we jump into Unit 2 with the White Temple and its ziggurat. This was an important sacred site that dated to the 4th millennium BC from Uruk, which is modern Warka in Iraq. And this is where life began pretty much more than 5,000 years ago, and writing first emerges. It's a very important place in southern Mesopotamia, and this is probably the greatest monument, the Anu ziggurat, on which the White Temple was built. It was dedicated to the sky god Anu, and the temple would have towered probably about 40 feet above the river plain of Uruk, and it would have been visible from a great distance. So ziggurats are structures built on raised platforms, or is a built raised platform with the temple on top, and it has these 4 sloping sides, sort of like a pyramid, but you've chopped off the top. It's made of mud brick, because remember, we don't have any stone quarries in this region. And ziggurats are not only the visual focus of a city, but a symbolic one. This is where the heart of the political system and the religious system come together. These city-states were run by a theocracy, which is a type of government where a god is recognized as a ruler, and the state officials operate on behalf of that god's wishes. So the ziggurat towers above the city. It makes a visual connection to the god or goddess honored there. It recognizes the deity's political authority. And the only people that really were allowed in the temple were the priests. And it was believed that the god descended, communed with the priests that ran the city-state, and then they would come out and communicate the god's wishes to the public. Excavators of the site believe that it probably took about 1,500 laborers working on an average of 10 hours a day for about 5 years to build the major stone facing of the underlying terrace. Then we've got the open area on the top as well, where the temple sits. So this would have been inspired by religious belief, of course, because they believe that the gods are important. They fear the gods. They believe the gods control their destinies, their crops, the rainfall, you name it. But also there would have been some coerced labor, probably some slave labor, maybe some captives that were used from warfare as a labor force as well. The top of the ziggurat, you got there by a very steep stairway, and this was a ramp that led around to the north end and brought you up to the temple entrance. And then the temple itself would have been whitewashed inside and out to really make it stand out. And so before we go any further, let me backtrack. And at the bottom, you'll see a couple terms you may want to think about as far as vocabulary with the asterisk. So this is made of mud brick. Remember, no stone. So they're actually making these bricks and firing them and then building with those kind of in an adobe process. It's whitewash. That's the white coat that you can see on the reconstructed drawing. The cella is the main chamber where the god was believed to descend and commune with the priest. This is also where the god's offerings were put. And then you see the ziggurat itself, this temple platform. And we're talking about ashlar masonry. So we're talking about stones, or I'm sorry, bricks that are created with precision so that no mortar is required and they can be sealed together airtight, and then probably coated again with some sort of mud coating to secure the structure. So the White Temple was rectangular, oriented to the cardinal points like the ziggurat, a long rectangular central hall with rooms on either side with 3 entrances, none of which faced the ramp directly, so you would have to walk around to access it. As I mentioned a minute ago, the cella was the chamber where the god was received by the priests, as well as the god was given his offerings. And one of the reasons they develop a writing system is to keep track of these offerings, because they have so many things coming into the temple that they need to make sure that they have a record of what's been given. The idea that the god would bless these offerings and then they would be maybe redistributed to the people, food products especially. So you needed to know, did you have enough grain to get through the winter? Did you have enough dried meat? And so cuneiform and a writing system would help secure that information and keep tallies of things so you were prepared for any such change of season or other event. Now, what we know is that access to the cella was limited to the god's priests, and the god would command them in the cella or kind of meet with them, give directions for the city state. And so since the average Sumerian or even an elite Sumerian was not allowed to enter the cella and worship the god directly, the ancient Mesopotamians would commission figures like these, votive figures or offering figures, to be placed in the cella to show their devotion to the patron deity. What you see here, the gods who again dwell in these temples would be received by these smaller, well, they're actually about 2.5 feet. They're not that small. These images of the faithful city-state members. And they would have in their hands little cups for libations or ritual drinks. And they would be given by a certain donor. And some of these have cuneiform inscriptions with the names of those donors written on them. Some of them would have inlaid eyes, sometimes black limestone, other times lapis lazuli, which is native to the region. And so the access to these small central shrines limited, but the statues would let the gods know that they were respected and then their presence was known. None of these have been found in situ through excavations, but they've been found buried in groups under the temple floor, sometimes built into cultic installations such as altars, even scattered in pieces around a shrine in the surrounding rooms. And this could be because when a temple was ever plundered or damaged, they would ritually bury these figures and other important artifacts for the culture. So there's a lot of statues and fragments that have been excavated, and really this is one of the few times that non-royal sculpture has existed in the ancient Near East. Most of the works we're going to see are going to be dedicated to this assertion of power and authority by rulers, as well as images of the gods. So these statues are actually different sizes, carved in gypsum and limestone. They depict men wearing fringed or tuft fleece skirts. The women wear similar style dresses draped over one shoulder with the tufts and the fringe border. The inlaid eyes, and they probably had painted hair. They were very carefully carved with their hands clasped, right over left, and the chest, at the chest or the waist, in a gesture of attentiveness. Their eyes are wide open, waiting in anticipation of the arrival of the deity, ever vigilant, ever in devotion to this theocratic entity. Standing figures often step forward with a left foot, and the male figures may be shown bald or wearing this kind of long, dreaded hairstyle, as well as beards. Females tend to have a variety of hairstyles and facial features. We found a large number of these at the temples and the sites of Tell Asmar, but the stylistic range tells us that there were different craftsmen creating these objects. So these are a type of object, not necessarily unique objects or one of a kind. They're naturalistic and highly abstract at the same time. So again, it would depend on the craftsman as to whether your figure was a little more abstracted or more realistic. And they seem to be contemporaneous in dates. They're being produced at the same time, just by different hands. The cuneiform inscriptions give the name of the god and the profession and name of the donor. So these dedicatory sculptures, again, found through numerous sites in Mesopotamia and seem to be connected with the worship that occurs at the site of the ziggurat. The standard of Ur from the royal tombs at Ur is another important work that we look at in Unit 2. And this one really found in fragments by Sir Leonard Woolley when he was excavating in the 1920s in this region. It's a Sumerian artifact from the 3rd millennium BC, and it's now in the British Museum, and it's pretty much a hollow wooden box that's about 8.5 inches by 19.5 inches, inlaid with mosaics of shell and limestone and lapis lazuli. And it comes from the ancient city of Ur, and the standard was probably constructed. They think it's been pieced back together, and they've determined that there were scenes of war and peace on each side and very elaborately inlaid mosaics. It was found in the largest of the royal tombs at the cemetery at Ur, associated with a king who died around 2550. And the discovery was really quite unexpected, as the tomb had been pretty thoroughly plundered by grave robbers in ancient times. And so when Sir Leonard Woolley and his team were working in the pit, a workman spotted a piece of shell inlay, and Woolley recalled that the next minute, the foreman's hand, carefully brushing away the earth, laid bare the corner of the mosaic in lapis lazuli and shell. And so basically, this was kind of a huge find. So lapis lazuli is a blue stone that is native to the region, and it for a long time it's one of the few sources of blue. You would actually import it, grind it up, and mix it to make your paints. It was a very expensive stone to import, and that's why a lot of times it's used for important religious figures in Western art, such as the Virgin Mary. We also see the presence of a hierarchy of scale here, or hierarchical perspective, with the ruler or the king shown largest in the center and towards the top. So again, this use of a larger scale for him indicates his power and authority, and he's the guy who's in charge. Since the standard of Ur only survived in fragmentary condition, and the ravages of time from about 4,000 years caused decay of the wooden frame, as well as the bitumen glue that held everything in place, and then the soil's weight crushed it, what we see here is pretty much a reconstruction. They very carefully recovered it in small sections measuring about 3 square centimeters each, covered them in wax, and that enabled the mosaics to be lifted and maintained the original designs at the same time. So very clever in the way they actually pull this thing out of the dirt and keep its integrity. The present form of the artifact is a reconstruction, as I mentioned, and pretty much the best guess of its original appearance. It has an irregular shape with end pieces in the shape of a truncated triangles, making it wider at the bottom than at the top, kind of like, let's see, maybe a Toblerone bar. The inlaid mosaic panels cover each side of the standard. The 2 mosaics have been dubbed the war side and the peace side in their subject matter respectively, because one side seems to be a military campaign, the other side scenes from a banquet. There are also end panels, which you see on the left here. These are my pictures from the British Museum that have this fantastical animals, but these were also pretty significantly damaged. On the right side, you actually see an image of one of my friends and fellow students from about, oh gosh, several years ago now, Lauren, and I show you this to show you exactly how small this thing is. When I first started studying this work, I thought it was about the size of a blanket chest, and it's really much smaller than that. As a standard, if that's exactly what it was used for, it probably could have been put on a pole and carried in front of a group of people, sort of like we carry flags nowadays in front of, processions in church or school, whatever you might need to do to be led into a large area. The war side is really one of the earliest representations of a Sumerian army, and they're engaged in what is believed to be a border skirmish and its aftermath. And the war shows, again, the king is at the top in the middle, standing taller than any other figure with his head projecting out of the frame to show his supreme status. And this is also used on the peace side, although he's seated. He faces a row of prisoners, all of whom are portrayed as naked and bound and injured with large bleeding gashes on their chests and thighs, this idea of showing defeat and debasement of the enemy. In the middle register, 8 virtually identical soldiers are given away. They give way to this battle scene, and again, we see captured enemies led away. The bottom register is particularly interesting because you see different chariots, and it tends to give a sense of motion. So here they seem to be standing still, and as the legs become farther and farther apart, they almost enter into a gallop, and they even gallop over more defeated enemies. The peace side portrays a banquet scene, and the king again shown larger than everyone else in the upper register on a carved stool on the left-hand side. He's faced by 6 other participants in the banquet, each holding a cup raised in the right hand, and you can see that they're even wearing the same kind of outfits as our worshiper figures, right? These fringed skirts. And so we see that he is attended by other figures, a long-haired individual, maybe a singer, a lyre player on the far right side, who you'll see here. And below in the 2 registers, we see the bringing of offerings, right? Animals, people carrying produce in shoulder bags and backpacks. All of these seem to be being brought to the king as some sort of tribute. So we may have the 2 complementary sides of Sumerian kingship being shown here on the standard. We're just not really entirely sure since it was discovered in fragments, and we haven't found too many records of what this thing did. I show you a close-up of the lyre player on the peace side, and just to kind of put in connection with this other object found from their tombs, which is actually a bull-headed lyre, similar to the one he's holding and playing. And you see that here, a little bit better detail. And it has the same fantastic creatures on the sound box down here, also kind of comprised in registers. And here you see another one of these fantastic beasts playing one of the lyres as well. Here we see the Stele of the Law Code of Hammurabi. This is a Babylonian work. So Hammurabi of the state of Babylon really comes a little bit later as a culture, and there's a lot of turnover in this region culturally as far as who's in charge and who's running things. Everybody wants that very rich soil between the 2 rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, and there's not a lot of geographic barriers to prevent invasion. So there's no mountain range blocking off kind of expansion and overthrow in the region. So Hammurabi conquers much of northern and western Mesopotamia, and by 1776 BCE, he's the most far-reaching ruler in Mesopotamian history. He's a micromanager. He's concerned with all aspects of his rule, and he produces a very famous law code, which is now on this stele or stele, a vertical stone monument in the Louvre. So here you see Hammurabi as an exemplary king of justice in an audience with the god Shamash at the top. And he's receiving the laws from the god, which makes them divinely sanctioned, just like he is a divinely sanctioned ruler. So we see him as a pious theocrat, right? This agent of the god. And so all of this gives legitimacy and power and authority to Hammurabi and his rule. We see hierarchical perspective again. Shamash is slightly larger, even though he's seated. And the patron, of course, would have been Hammurabi. This work is gigantic. It is 7 feet 4 inches. It would have pretty much towered over the average Babylonian. So it would have had this, by its sheer scale, it would have also had this kind of presence and authority in their lives. You see different attributes. In this case, you see Hammurabi being handed the rod and the ring, which are builder's tools. So Shamash hands him the ability to build a successful empire, a powerful rule, and to create this law code. Nearly half the laws on this deal with matters of contract, and there are 282 laws in total. They deal with different scaled punishments. Probably the most famous one you may have heard of is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But there are other laws here about issues of household and family relationships, terms of transactions, provisions about an obligation. So lots of kind of contract law actually on this thing. The head of the stone, as I mentioned, he's receiving the law code from Shamash. And what we see here, there's actually an inscription that says, Anu and Bel call me by name Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash and enlighten the land to further the well-being of mankind. So this idea of carving these in stone and imported stone, the expense speaks to the power and authority he has as a patron. The intensive law code speaks to his ability to impose this kind of law over a group of people. The scale shows his power and authority, and the fact he's sitting conversing eye to eye with a god at the top just kind of doubles down on all that. So the code of laws is arranged in an orderly way, and you could read the laws and know what was required of you. And it is the longest surviving text from the Old Babylonian period. So we now turn our attention to the kings of Assyria, another group who comes in after another turnover in leadership, expansion, and then taking over the region. And we have the great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal II, who begins a vast building program. And so then his son will come in, Sargon, or grandson, I guess. And remember, we don't have a lot of timber and other materials, so we're importing these things from the coast of Phoenicia, and we have all of this documented in contemporary Assyrian letters. So the building of the citadel here of Sargon II, the great city entirely built in the decade preceding 706 BC, when the court was moved to Dar-Shurukin, although it was never completely finished because Sargon was killed in battle. And his unexpected death and his successor really abandons the project and relocates the capital to Nineveh. So this is never completely finished as a complex, but it is substantially built out. So the palace is adorned with a lot of sculptures and reliefs. The gates are all flanked by winged bull Lamassu, which is one of your works in Unit 2 as well. And these weigh up to 40 tons each. In addition to this great city, there was also a royal hunting park that included all different parts, all different types of animals, particularly lions, this idea that defeating the king of beasts showed their power and authority in the region as well. And then any remnants of Dar-Shurukin were actually destroyed by ISIL in 2015. So all we have left are things like reconstructed drawings. On the Lamassu, a standard inscription runs across the surface of most of these figures and the reliefs around them. I built there on a palace with halls of cedar, cypress, juniper, boxwood, teak, terebinth, and tamarisk as my royal dwelling and for my enduring leisure life of my lordship. Beasts of the mountains and the seas, which I have fashioned out of white limestone and alabaster, I had set up at its gates. I made it the palace fittingly imposing. So these stone beasts with these human heads and these large horned helmets that are like winged lions are divinities. Really, they're considered sacred, and the sculptor makes these guardian figures so they stand very firmly when viewed from the front as well as the side. So they actually have 5 legs when we take a couple looks at the details. So these Lamassu come from protective deities from Sumerian times, and then over time they kind of develop, and the Assyrians make them a hybrid of a bird, a man, and either a bull or a lion. So specifically, they have a human head, a body of a bull or a lion, and then the bird's wings. And there are several of these. There were different gates at the site, and so we actually have these Lamassu in several museums around the world, including the Louvre. These are in the British Museum. We have them at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, and so the Met has one, I believe. And so Assyrian sculpture would pretty much place these things in pairs at the entrances of palaces, facing the street and also the internal courtyards. So they had this kind of double aspect to them. So you would see from the side, they would have 5 legs, which you can see in the image on the right, from the front 2 legs. Some of them are frontal, others might have their heads turned. So it would just depend on where they were placed and what they were supposed to be kind of orienting and how they were supposed to be directing the viewer or the visitor as to whether they were frontal or they had their heads turned. These were considered household protective spirits of the common Babylonian people, and they were later associated as royal protectors. So they weren't always kind of had the royal association, but by the time of the Assyrians, they had been fully adopted. The entrance of the cities also would have Lamassu. They were sculpted in colossal size and again placed in pairs. Each one tended to look towards a cardinal point. So here you can see these are details from the British Museum pair. So you have these large wings, this attempt at kind of an abstracted form of texture of the wings and the fur on the animal's body, text in the Mesopotamian cultural language, different dialects. Again, here, this kind of stylized attempt at fur and musculature. So these are certainly a conceptual rendering of these beings. A lot of times they are also flanked by a human form, also wearing the same helmet with attributes. We saw the same helmet on the god Shamash. So these are deities, these are figures of power, and these are humans that also have power and authority. And all of this ties together with religious beliefs. Today, in modern culture, we see the Lamassu carry on. The British 10th Army, which operated in Iraq in the 20th century from 1942 to 1943, actually adopted the Lamassu as their insignia. And then we also see here the winged bull body appears on the logo of the Iraqi Air Force, as well as the United States forces in Iraq. Finally, and it's interesting that we kind of end here. John did a great job yesterday telling us all about the Greeks, and then of course this is one of the major enemies, let's go with that, or of the Greeks, the Persians. And so this is Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire from 550 to 330 BC. And so, of course, they attacked the Greeks in 480. They're finally pushed back by the Greeks in that time period. And then this will stand actually until Alexander the Great pushes all the way into Persia and finally puts that Persian threat out of business and actually adopts the Persian culture into the larger Greek Empire. These are the earliest archaeological remains of the site, pretty much dating to 515, and Persepolis simply means city of the Persians in Greek. It was known as Parsa to the Persians themselves and an important city in the ancient world. Excavated in the 1930s by German archaeologists, it was intentionally founded on the Marvast Plain during the later part of the 6th century BCE because it was considered a special site to Darius the Great. He indicated that the location of the royal hill that would serve as a ceremonial center and the citadel for the city. So it's all thanks to Darius that it gets its siting here. It will remain an important site again until it is sacked, looted, and burned by Alexander in 330. And so, you know, Someone today told me that they always thought of the Greeks as the good guys, and I guess that depends on whether you're Greek or Persian, because the Greeks certainly came in and did their own kind of damage to the Persian structures. Scholars debate the purpose and nature of the site. Primary sources think that Darius saw himself as building an important stronghold here. It had administrative and economic activities that took place here. We look at it primarily for the audience hall, which is a large ceremonial building with an associated porch that you can see. The audience style or audience hall style would have been that hypostyle hall plan, meaning it was a roof supported with large columns. Originally 72 columns were here that supported the roof, only 14 remain standing today. And the column capitals were in the form of either twin-headed bulls, eagles, or lions, or animals that all represented royal authority and kingship. The king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire is presumed to have received guests as well as tribute here in this very large, imposing space. And so the theme of the program that we see in the reliefs down here at the bottom of the image are representatives of different subject nations bringing their tributes to the king. Here's a little bit better detail. So the sculptures form this processional scene. They think that scholars, or leading scholars to think that these are actual scenes of tribute processions, maybe annual processions, sort of like the Pan-Athenaic procession that was happening in Greece to go up to the Parthenon. The relief program probably completed 500 to 490 BCE, and the two sets of stereo reliefs mirror and complement each other. And they each show the king flanked by attendants and guards as well. You see the noblemen in the procession wearing elite outfits and military apparel with their attendants. And so all of this relief work seems to reinforce and underscore the power of not only the Persian king, the importance of the site, and the breadth of his dominion. The motif of subjugated peoples contributing their wealth to the empire's central authority serves to visually cement the political dominance of the Persians, which again, that's another one of the big themes here in this region is the power and authority, the right to rule, the ability to hold large areas under your dominion. We also find Lamassu here. So just because they get introduced by the Assyrians, they are something that starts in Sumer, continues through Babylon, continues into the Assyrian culture, and then into the Persian culture as one culture continues to take over and overlap the conventions of the other. Here are some reconstructed drawings of the audience hall, and you can see those capitals that were mentioned earlier, decorated with the four parts of bulls, lions, and griffins carved in the round. And the sculptures basically showing that the power that the king had to capture these beasts and put them in service to support the ceiling. Even though it's symbolically occurring, all of this decoration would have been, again, reinforcing that idea of the power of the Persians and their leaders. Here's an example of one of these columns or column capitals, and the roof would have rested on the horns. And so again, the idea here was that they captured these strong beasts and forced them to support the ceiling. It's carved from dark gray limestone and highly polished, and each head measures over 2 meters high and weighs about 10 tons. They are enormous and beautifully sculpted, and here are some examples from where the horns have been removed from the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And so what you see here, again, sometime over the past when the city was sacked, the heads became detached from the bodies, the horns were removed, maybe in some sort of possible way of desecrating the site, or stripping the power from these beasts and rendering them impotent, but they are still beautiful and elaborate and extravagant examples of court art and architecture. So some things to consider today. The cultures of the ancient Near East are creating works of art and architecture that are focused on religion, because remember, they believe that they are in direct, their leaders, their priests, their kings are in direct communion with the gods and this theocracy setup that we have in the region, as well as power and authority. So not only do they have the right to rule and are they in touch with the gods, and it's important to honor these gods, but they also show themselves in scenes that or create objects that reinforce the fact they have the right to rule and be in that region and control large dominions of territory. And since these seem to be our two major themes, we see this not only in the forms, the Lamassu, the scale of these objects like the Stele of Hammurabi, the styles, this use of composite beasts, large beasts considered very powerful, materials, that use of stone, which we see in, it's a region that's stone poor. So the fact that they're importing all this stone, trading their goods for it, again, speaks to the power and authority and the importance of the religion to have these works created out of stone. And then the content. We have these great beasts, we have codes of law, we have worshiper figures, even though they're smaller in scale and made for a different purpose, showing their devotion to these gods who function as their rulers. So in every aspect, form, style, material, content, all of these things reinforce the themes of power and authority, as well as the importance of religious devotion. Before we check out for today, let's take a look at the question John left you with yesterday. So he left you with two works, a classical work on the right and a Hellenistic work on the left. And so first of all, we need to describe two differences. And so describe is a pretty entry-level task with this, so we can talk about the differences in material, certainly, one marble, one bronze. We can talk about the posture, one standing somewhat confidently as an athlete that's getting ready to compete, the other seated in a defeated posture with his mouth open looking up at the victor. In this kind of different time period where the Greeks have been really stretched too thin. So we talk about the classical period on the right. They're confident, they're cocky, they've got the world at their feet. And then as the empire has stretched beyond its bounds, its ability to control so much region, as all of the different cultures have come under the Greek umbrella and begun to influence or have different cultural groups in Greece, we see this kind of sense of the Greeks being tired, worn out, and defeated as they're trying to hold such a great landmass. If you can't hold the center, you can't hold the fringes. How do they demonstrate continuity with ideals of Greek values and aesthetics? So even though we have this defeated posture on the left, we haven't lost proportionality. We haven't lost the attention to musculature, the human form. We're still focused, we're still showing our athletes as physically fit. In competing in the nude, which they did, but we also have this sense of they're just different kind of moods about them. We don't have a larger head and a small body, or a small body and a large head like we see with some of the later Roman emperors down the road. We have this sense of the importance of man and man's accomplishments, or man's defeat in this case, as well as the intense look at human anatomy. Before I leave you today, I have a little question for you myself. And this is a work from Mesopotamia that is not in the image set. This is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin. And based on what we've talked about today, some of the things used for power and authority and religion as the big themes, I want you to take a look at this work. It's made out of stone. And you see Naram-Sin here. I gave you a little detail, and these are some of his troops, and they are some of the enemy. So for tonight, I'd like for you to kind of take a look at this and maybe see what you can do to explain how it reflects this culture's emphasis on power and authority. How is Naram-Sin shown? What is the significance of stone in this culture? What does it mean to have this kind of work created to represent a ruler? So my name is Allison Napier. Again, thanks for tuning in and spending your afternoon with me. If you have any issues with technology, as always, please make sure you contact us at cb.org/tech. And thanks so much for coming today, and enjoy your afternoon. I hope it's beautiful weather wherever you are and you're getting a taste of spring. And Jack has done really great. So you didn't even know he was in his kennel and possibly could raise a ruckus, but he hasn't. So thank goodness he slept. Okay, so that's it for me today. Have a great afternoon and stay healthy, art historians.